the whole last session, but just where we got to. The thing that we were talking about there at the end was that when the age of authenticity and that ideal of authenticity, when that hits spirituality or religious faith, then it means that it's going to have to speak to us as an individual, okay? It's going to have to speak to me as a person, okay? What that does, when the ideal of authenticity enters into that part of human existence that we call now the religious space or the spiritual kind of space, it means that the fundamental, this is Taylor again, he says, look, what that means now is that the fundamental part, the fundamental expression of spirituality is of a quest. It's a quest. Why? Because I'm searching to find the thing that's going to speak to me. I'm searching to find the religious practice or the spiritual belief that actually resonates with who I understand myself to be. So that means that it's always going to look like something of a quest for people today in our culture. And that again has a challenge, but it also has potential. So part of what I've been trying to get at here with the age of authenticity is that I actually think that there's something here that, yes, there are, Taylor will say, look, there are trivialized expressions of this, okay? The age of authenticity can take you down the eat, pray, love kind of direction, and that's all you're kind of focusing on, right? That's the, you've become a spiritual person because you've, read the book and you've decided that you're, that's the solution to what you're looking for. So it can end up in trivial self-fulfillment kind of ways, right? But even that book, even Elizabeth Gilbert's journey, speaks to something of a genuine search, or even, we might say, quest, right? And so to say it's just trivial is to dismiss something that's actually going on inside of people. And I want to go as far as to suggest that while there might be trivial expressions, there's also something here that we want to actually celebrate and say, when somebody actually takes hold of this, when their journey, when their quest takes them into the life of faith, which it does, not for everybody, but when it does, what you actually have is somebody who's deeply owning and appropriating what we believe. They're not just doing it because, that's what you do. They're not just doing it because mum and dad told them to. They're not just doing it because that's what everybody else is doing. They're doing it because they've actually said, this is me. The deepest expression of who I am as a person is found in my relationship with Christ. Part of what I think really matters here then is what we're trying to say is that there's shadows and light in that, but I think we can actually say that this is something of, could we go as far? I think we can, to say that the Spirit might be at work in the culture with this ideal of authenticity. That it actually might be the Spirit at work in the world. We actually say that as Christians, as part of the teaching of the Catholic Church, is that the Spirit's at work in every culture. And one of the things that I think in many circles in the church in recent years has been to say, we can find that, we say that's true of every culture except ours. That's for a lot of people, modernity is this bad thing, irremediably evil in some way. But could this not actually be something of the Spirit? Now, it's not without its shadows. You can end up in a sort of self-trivializing, self-fulfillment kind of thing, right? Can also end up in that perpetual kind of questing and searching where you move from one fad to the next, right? That can happen, all right? The Spirit of God's movement in the world is never without our human imperfections in saying yes, never without our inadequate responses. But I think that we can and we ought to be able to say that God's at work here. If we only have a theoretical concept that God works outside the church, then I think that we're missing something of the largeness of God, the largeness of the Spirit of God at work in the world. Okay, so if it takes the shape of a quest, then we want to understand that and we want to respect that a little bit. What that also means, another implication here, is that remember I started with that description of the three different kind of responses that our researchers divided young Australians up into. They were either seculars, traditional, meaning Christian, or New Agers. I'm thinking those categories are starting to feel very inadequate in the light of what we've been talking about. And particularly what I think we could understand is that there really actually have been there were two poles. So one pole is sort of traditional belief in Christian faith, you might say. The other pole is what Taylor calls exclusive humanism, which would be kind of an atheistic, there is no God, right? And then what happens between those two poles is that lots of people find themselves in one or the other, but far more people find themselves saying, you know what, I can't come at Christian faith, but I'm also not a resolute atheist either. Or they say, you know what, there's more to life, there's something I don't understand. They might call it mystery. They might say, I've got a sense of spirituality. They might say there's some stuff I can't understand. I think there's a higher power. I'm a long way from Christian faith, but I'm not an atheist either. So Taylor calls that the nova effect. This is actually a supernova, okay? And he talks about a galloping pluralism on the spiritual plane. What's he saying? He's saying that as everybody defines themselves in relation to those two poles, they find themselves saying, well, I'm going to define my place, and it's going to look different from someone else's place. So this is where you get it's become a trendy kind of thing to talk about the spiritual but not religious phenomenon, right? Okay, so spiritual is everything other than religious, right? So religious, traditional expression of faith. Spiritual can mean a whole bunch of different things, and a young person can mean it in a different way to another young person, or an older person can mean it in a different way to a younger person too. They can find their sense of spirituality in creation, music, art. They can find it in a particular kind of relationship or practice. It may actually be that it was originally embedded in a religion and isn't anymore, like yoga, for example. Okay, so once embedded in a religious practice, now it's been taken out of that. It could be something like the doctrine of reincarnation. Again, belongs to two of the great world religions, but has been taken out by people to say, yeah, I believe that there's something after death. They're not prepared to call it heaven or subscribe to a traditional Christian doctrine of eternal life, but they're saying this can't be all there is. And so they say reincarnation. Yeah, I believe in reincarnation. What's going on here is that there's this galloping pluralism, like a whole bunch of different people saying, I think this and I believe that and I see it like this and I find it like that. As perhaps potentially scary as it is, I think this is a much more accurate image than kind of a pie in three pieces of where young people stand in relation to faith. As daunting as that might be at one level, I think there's actually much more, there's something actually this is much more true to our actual experience at this time, okay? And daunting on the one hand, but also on the other hand, what it actually invites us to do, I think, is to take seriously each person, rather than lumping them in and categorising them and saying, you're this, being able to actually say, you know what, I'm going to actually engage with you, okay? And to sort of foreshadow a little bit around where might we go as a church. A big part of our response might be, how do I actually listen to this particular young person? How do I understand and engage and hear their story? And it really will be one story at a time, okay? It really will be one story at a time. There are ways that we can structure that, and ways that we can support and assist that, but if we have a supernova of possible stances in relation to spirituality as we understand it, or traditional Christian faith, then what we're saying here is that people are going to have to, we're going to have to find ways to meet people in their different places and spots, rather than saying, oh, you're this or you're that. Okay. This is a quote from that same study of young Australians. So this young woman was asked the question, do you believe in God? Right now, probably not. I'm at that stage because I went to a religious primary school and that was sort of God this and God that. Now I'm getting sort of different ideas from everyone, having everyone's life experiences and things, what they believe in thrown at me. So now I'm finding out what I believe in too. Can you hear that authenticity piece? Can you hear the identity question? I'm finding out who I am in relationship to others, in relation to what they're saying about what they believe. Okay. I'm actually baptised Lutheran because I've been baptised and confirmed and done all the steps at church. but that's in my family. Religion, like you're born into that. When you're sort of old enough to actually start saying, hang on, what about this, what about that? I don't believe this or that. So I'm sort of finding my way. Yeah? Sort of finding my way. So you can hear much of what we've been talking about here, I think, around that concept of the quest. Yeah? Okay? Raised religiously, and now saying to herself, hang on a minute, I'm not sure what I believe. Lots of people tell me lots of things. I'm finding my way. Yeah? Now you could hear that as individualism. You could hear that as Frank Sinatra. I did it my way. All right, Father Ken. If you haven't heard the Father Ken, I did it my way homily, you've missed out, let me tell you. You could hear it as that, or you could hear it as the desire to be authentically true to who she is. Okay? Yeah? All right. Another aspect of this is that when young people today say, I can't come at Christian faith, they're not, what they need to be able to, what they needed, and in a sense what was actually even needed for the birth of an alternative to being a Christian, for that to actually to have come into the world, what was needed was a compelling account of human existence that was different. Okay? So what was that compelling account? Well, it actually begins, I think, with the Reformation. So the Protestant Reformation, 16th century. One of the things that the reformers were really big on was that they said, look, there aren't two kind of degrees of Christians, the holy monks and then everybody else, right? There's not two classes or two statuses of Christians. Everybody's called to be holy. Everyone's called to be fully in relationship with God. It's not like there's a spiritually accelerated kind of learning program and then the rest of us all kind of struggling to make do. So what they said was the crucial way to be holy was that it was through ordinary life. You didn't have to become a monk, but if you were a good family man or woman, and if you worked hard, you did honest work, whether that was, for the bloke out in the field or he was a merchant or whatever he might have been. And obviously in this time, of course, for a woman, it was if she was working in the home. If they did that, then that was a path to being holy. Okay? Ordinary life was where you found God. Ordinary life was where you were in relationship with God. Now, there's something really absolutely beautiful and true of that, right? Okay? What happened, though, was that when you then get to the period that we sometimes call the Enlightenment, was that the Christian origin of that was taken away. Okay? So what was motivating it was what you might call a practical agape. The reformers said, look, the way you love as God wants us to love is by loving your family and doing honest day's work, being just in your dealings with others. When you take away the Christian motivation for that, and it gets replaced with something like it though, something that looks really close to it, which is kind of an altruism or a benevolence that says it's not because of Christ that we do this, but because it's actually about caring for others. It's shorn of the ordinary life's value, that family life matters, that work matters. Its Christian roots are taken away, and then the critique's turned back on itself. And now what happens is that the people, like the Enlightenment non-believers, if you like, say, hang on a minute, eternal life actually gets in the way of living ordinary life well. You guys are so hung up on heaven that you're not actually caring enough about this world. Do you see how that worked? So what emerges from that is a compelling alternative to Christian faith. That ordinary life is where good things are found. That by celebrating the gift of ordinary life, meaningful work, especially when you add the authenticity piece, work becomes a way that I can express who I am. This is why young people don't storm the barricades or take to the streets like they did in the 60s, but they all want to start an NGO, right? They do want to make a difference. They do want to make a contribution, but they want to do it through the lens of authenticity, which is, I'm not going to join a mass movement. I'm going to start my charity. I'm going to do my project. Yeah? Same motive. Young people today are as idealistic and passionate about social change, I think, as people were in the 60s. But in the 60s, it got expressed as a mass movement. Let's take to the streets. Let's try and, we'll sit in at the university. We'll do all those sorts of things. Today, they say, no, I'm going to create my own little project, and I'm going to go do that maybe with a small group of like-minded others. Same passion, same motive, but now too, can you hear that powerful, that's that ethic of altruism and benevolence. I'm not doing it because the gospel motivates me, I'm doing it because that's actually what we should do and care for. It's normal and natural to do that. That's so embedded that it's self-evident. So people in our culture today don't recognise its profoundly Christian origins. They don't realise that it's actually the Christian ethic of self-giving love in obedience to Jesus. They don't realise that that's where it starts from. And they say, well, of course you're supposed to love each other. Of course you're supposed to love someone on the other side of the world, right? But you know, the only way that kind of ethic came into not just Western culture, but into the world was through the gospel. Okay? Prior to the gospel, prior to Jesus, you loved your family, you loved your tribe, you might have even loved your nation. Nobody else got a look in. It's Jesus' ethic of self-giving love that is universal, that actually, and so that love of who is my neighbour in the parable of the Good Samaritan, whoever is right in front of me and needs my help, right? That's a profound. That's not natural. Can I put it that way? It's not self-evident. No other culture in the world has that ethic. Okay. But what's happened in Western culture is that that's been removed. It's been pulled up and plucked up, if you like, out of its original Christian context. And so now we think that, oh, of course, that's what you're supposed to think about human beings. It's supposed to be. But it actually has its origins in Christian faith. The key point to take away from this is that there's a seemingly compelling alternative to Christian faith that's emerged. So young people aren't just saying, I don't come at the Christian thing. They're saying, I actually really believe in something else. I want to live by something else. The challenge there for us, and again to anticipate some of the later talks in the series that we're doing, is that what it calls the church to is a compelling alternative vision, right? That we actually have a better story even than that. It's not a bad story. It's got its challenges and its limitations. But we have a better story of who we are called to be as human beings in Christ. Okay? And so part of the art, I think, of sharing the gospel, of proclaiming the love of God to the world will be there's an alternative story to the story. And when I say story that young people have bought into, and not just young people, again, it's our culture. We're not saying here that they consciously go, I live by that story. We all live by stories, but it's implicit, right? So the gospel is an alternative story, okay, that names who we are and how we're supposed to be in relation to others. So again, anticipating a subsequent talk, we're going to have to talk about how do we do that, okay? All right. Another part of this, imagine if this young woman decides after a period of this kind of searching, you can hear her asking questions, can't you? She's searching. Imagine if she decides after a period of searching, she's chucked in the Lutheran faith at the moment that she's grown up with. Imagine if she, through, probably won't be from a family, it'll probably be that she meets maybe a good Lutheran boy, or she meets some other young people perhaps who offer an attractive witness of Christian faith, and she finds herself revisiting her faith, okay? And saying, with the faith that I chucked out as a kid, maybe there was something there after all. Imagine if she does that, okay? That's not an inconceivable story. That might even be the story of some of us in the room, right? Okay? The distinction I want to make here is that in a sense, she's believing again, isn't she? She's believing again. She was raised in some level of faith. She's chucked it for a period and she's now believing again in it, okay? Contrast that with believing still. That there are some people who I've always believed, I've believed all my life, I've never really shaken from that, okay? Maybe it's grown, maybe it's been deeper, but I've never really been shaken from that. They're believing still. The what we might call the builder generation, so they're the parents of the baby boomers, so they're my grandparents, okay? That's my grandpa and my grandmother, right? They never deviated for a moment from their Catholic faith. It was like It was embedded in them. And all of the changes that we've talked about, and they lived through, the first 30 years of that revolution that we've been talking about, none of that shook their faith, even as they watched, one of their kids chuck it in and so on and so forth, right? They believe still. What I think is the case now is that that's not true anymore, okay? That to grow up in this culture, it'll be believing again. Even if that believing again is pretty short. I sometimes say that I fell into the believing again by a couple of months. So the Easter of my 16th year, I decided that I was on a YMCA conference. I worked for the YMCA, and I decided I wasn't going to go to church because nobody on the conference was going to church. I knew that was a big deal. My dad had said to me when I once tentatively said that maybe I wouldn't go to Mass, he said, well, that's fine. You can keep living at home, or you can stop going to church. It's really easy. So for my father, it was not a tough decision, So I hadn't gone to church this Easter. I knew that was a big deal. I was kind of half expecting a bolt of lightning, I've got to tell you, okay? And I expected my mum and dad just to know, even though I was up here in Sydney and mum and dad lived in Canberra. I was up here for the conference. I somehow expected that they would guess, that they'd know that there'd be a label that said Chris didn't go to church at Easter, And I must have lied. I don't know if they even asked me. Within a few short months of that, one of my teachers had invited me for the upteenth time on a retreat, and I went, and that was the catalyst to my believing again, right? So my period of questioning and searching, really it meant wagging Mass once, right? For some people that'll be years, okay? Okay, it'll be years. But none of us believe still anymore, okay? Now the exception to that is, again, if people are from other cultures where faith is embedded in the culture, you're much more likely to say, I believe still. Nothing really shakes it. It might grow, it might be depthed, okay? But this is actually part of who you are, and it's hard to imagine. So in the Spirit of Generation Y study that we were talking about, the ones that kind of looked most like this were people who were from Papua New Guinea and Samoa. I think there were Filipinos. When they were interviewed, they said, look, religion isn't about what speaks to me. That language, that didn't even occur to them to use that kind of language. What they said was it provides rules for life. Right? You say rules to life to a 16-year-old Caucasian Australian man or young man or woman, they'll say, you can have that. But for people from a different culture who haven't imbibed what we're talking about in the same kind of way, they say, yeah, of course it's rules for life. And you need rules for life. You've got to live by something. And they're not wrong. They're just seeing it very, very differently, right? Okay? They're seeing it very, very differently. Believing again and believing still. That has big implications for the way we do ministry, whether it's with young people or with older generations. We've actually got to invite everybody to believe again. Yeah? We've got to invite everybody to believe again. All right. If you've got a question, hold that thought. We're definitely going to have a chance to talk. All righty. So, here's another quote from the Spirit of Generation Y study. It's a long quote. I'm sorry about that. So what it is that as part of like a focus group kind of study. So there was originally the telephone survey that I mentioned before. And then the second part was that they did a further follow-up study where they brought some of the young people in for an interview, okay? And as part of that, they were given all these pictures put out on a table, and they could pick the ones that spoke to them, okay? Young woman picked an image of a stained glass window, okay? So she's now commenting, imagine this quote, she's commenting on her picture of the stained glass window. It's funny actually, this picture. I'm not religious in any way at all. I'm really atheistic, but I don't know just how it's beautiful. I don't understand it. I mean, that kind of thing, like trying to figure out why I'm not religious or what I do believe in, is a big part of my life because I've got so many people telling me that they're not religious or that they believe this or that. So much of the international stuff, it's conflict over religion, and I just don't understand how people can believe certain things. So, it's virtually her stream of consciousness, isn't it? It's her reaction to this picture. But isn't it revealing? Okay? it reveals a number of things to me anyway. I think one of the things is she's captured by the beauty of the stained glass window. Right? She knows enough about church to be able to say, well, that's something to do with faith and belief, right? She says, I don't understand. Why is it that people are thinking, it's grabbed me. It's just beautiful. I'm an atheist, but it's beautiful. Taylor, when he reflects on something like this, he had, to the best of my knowledge, he's never read this study, but he talks about, in the light of that nova effect, or the supernova, in the light of this huge array of options on the spiritual kind of plane, he says, what is going to happen is that nobody's going to be so firmly embedded in one that they can't be actually kind of have their beliefs, he uses the word fragilized, that their belief won't be made fragile in some way by the beliefs of somebody else. And can't you hear that in what she's saying? She's saying, look, I really don't believe in God, but there's something here that's grabbed me that I'm associating with mystery or the divine in some way, because she's kind of saying it's beautiful, I don't understand it. And then she goes on to say, some people are trying to tell me they believe, some people are trying to tell me they don't. You can hear this, right? And it doesn't mean that she's kind of really searching, it doesn't mean that she's kind of on a really firm, deliberate search to find out exactly what she believes. She can probably go on through life most of the time without worrying much about the fact that her stance is a fragile one, but her stance is a fragile one. Okay? Think back to the pie chart where it was broken up in all the sorts of pieces. Think about the people who said they were undecided about whether they believed in God. Think about those people who are nominal in the various different categories. Part of what we're saying here is that belief, it's much more tentative and much more fragile. And for a lot of young people, I think, when faced with this, they say, you know what, that's actually all a bit too hard. And I'm not sure if I can actually land in one place definitively. And so I'm going to be tentative about a lot of things. So you ask them on the right day and they might say, yeah, there's something in this. And then you ask them the next day, they might say, yeah, there's something in that. And it's not that they are just wishy-washy, it's that in the face of this incredible array of options and possibilities, they're saying, I'm just going to be really tentative about all of it. How do I know possibly that I should really invest in this one or that one? Does that ring true? Yeah. To me, as I read this in total, I went, oh yeah, that describes so many young people that I've sat with over the years. And let's be real, it describes us too, right? It describes us too, in one way or another. Okay. So, you can also hear something of that tentativeness when she gets to the stuff about international conflict over religion. She's saying, look, some people are saying this is a force for good in the world. I can see that there are problems that are around wars and that's got something to do with people's beliefs in God. Too hard. Just too hard to make a definitive decision about. So I'm going to be tentative about that as well. Okay. Where does that leave us? It leaves us with perhaps two kind of characters that Taylor wants to point to. He says a seeker is somebody who's embarked upon that quest, right? So somebody who's saying, yep, the ideal of authenticity means that I'm searching for something in relation to spirituality, however I understand that. Remember the supernova again, okay? But I'm looking for something. I'm searching for something more, okay? Seekers. Dwellers, by contrast, are somebody who has accepted a religious authority that's as a legit, and I was about to say as external to them, that is external to them, but that's complicated, because if you think about religious authorities, they may start as external, but if we appropriate them sufficiently, they become internal to us too, right? So the image of the Bible, okay, what we're saying here is somebody might say, I'm a dweller, in Taylor's terminology, is somebody who says, I've accepted that the Bible has an authority in my life, that I'm trying to live my life by what the scriptures, which I believe are the word of God, teach me. Or they might say, I'm a deeply committed Catholic, and so I'm trying to live my life with the idea that I accept that there's an authority that the Catholic Church has that's been given by God, and I accept that. Ultimately, the authority is God. but there'll be mediating things, whether that's the scriptures or the church, it might be something else, okay? Taylor calls them dwellers. So they're saying, I recognise an authority that in some way is beyond me, but I'm trying to live in accordance with or congruent with, okay? Again, coming back to, when Taylor talks about a dweller, he says, look, there might be people who are dwellers. The example he uses are people who've undergone dramatic conversions in places like Brazil, other parts of South America, Africa. Maybe they've gone from, like really dramatic testimonies like I was into drugs, I was sleeping around, I was doing X, Y, or Z, and now I'm this. And he says that those people tend to really clearly say, I've got an authority in my life that is not mine. Perhaps when it was left up to me, I made a complete hash of my life. I accept the authority of God in my life. Yeah. When I reread The Spirit of Generation Y study and the young people in the light of this, there are two groups of people that I think jump out. One was that group. There are a group of people that they interviewed who were first or second generation from countries like Papua New Guinea and Samoa, as I mentioned, where they say, yeah, there are rules for life in Christian faith, in the scriptures. That's where I want to live. But I also think there are some people too who often, perhaps because they've had a fairly intense religious socialisation in their family, who also pretty naturally find themselves here. That if they've believed again, it's maybe looks a little bit like me. It's been pretty quick and hasn't been a dramatic shift or anything like that. Okay, does that make sense? And I think there are people like that. Okay, but we've got to recognise that that's a really small group of people. Yeah, that the vast majority of young people in our culture, if they're experiencing some idea around spirituality, if they're on a quest looking for meaning in their life and pointing in some way to the transcendent, however they understand that, they're seeking, yeah? And they're looking for an expression of spirituality or religious life that speaks to them, that makes sense to them where they are, okay? Now, here's the thing. I want to argue, we can absolutely let's throw this around if you'd like to. I want to argue that a knee-jerk reaction for the church will be to say we've got to turn the seekers into dwellers. Okay? But there's a very legitimate part of Christian faith. It's deep in our Christian tradition that we're to continue seeking the face of God. That when I encounter Jesus and I'm transfixed by him, that doesn't end my search. At one level it does, but at another level it takes me on this lifelong journey of discovering more about the God that I'm falling in love with. It doesn't stop there. It takes a decisive kind of shift. We might even call it the shift from being a seeker to being a pilgrim, maybe. Can I make that distinction? That a seeker is somebody who perhaps, in the words of U2, still haven't found what they're looking for. That for a pilgrim, they found what they're looking for, but they're still searching for more of what they have been looking for. Okay? So the dynamic kind of shifts a little bit, but the dynamic is still real in Christian faith. Equally, we do want to say that there's an important place for responsible dwelling. Okay? Now, responsible dwelling, the word responsible is key there. Irresponsible dwelling is fundamentalism. Okay? Irresponsible dwelling is, I believe because the Bible tells me so, without any critical engagement with it. Or, I believe because the Catholic Church tells me that that's what I should do, without actually trying to understand what the Catholic Church teaches, trying to explore it. There are different forms of fundamentalism, but irresponsible dwelling is, I actually abdicate legitimate searching, legitimate seeking, legitimate desiring to grow and actually also realise my humanity in and through that, in order to say, well, I found what I'm looking for, hallelujah, all right? But there's a place for responsible dwelling, which is, I recognise that I'm not the master of my fate. I recognise that I'm not in sole control of my life. I recognise that an integral part of being a disciple of Jesus is that I've surrendered my life to him. That I'm saying, you're in charge. That I do want to actually recognise God's authority in my life. Not in an uncritical way, not in a way that I have to leave my brain at the door when I come to church. It's never been the Catholic tradition, okay? But rather in a way that engages me fully in the fullness of who I am, which includes my mind, but isn't defined or confined by my mind. I'm able to say, yeah, I actually recognise that you are God and I'm not. That you are actually Lord of the universe and I'm not Lord of my own life. And I want you to be in charge. I want you to direct me. I want you to lead me and guide me. That's also deeply embedded in our Christian tradition, is it not? And so the challenge for us, first of all, for us as followers ourselves, but then also then in how do we invite others and young people especially into that, is how do we make sure that we're both seekers and dwellers? Yeah? That both are really crucial dimensions of the life of faith. Okay? Both are really crucial dimensions of the life of faith. The reality, of course, too, is that nobody is purely a seeker or purely a dweller even before this. There were always a bit of a mixture of both. But what we're saying here is that Christian faith requires us to be quite intentionally both. This is about being able to grow and at the same time also being able to surrender. It's about the grace of what we might call conversion. So, a little West Wing reference. I just thought I'd throw in a little joke at the end. President Bartlett saying, "What's next?" No? I thought that was kind of funny. So what's next? What I hope we've done, I think it's so important that we start with a description of where we are, okay? The technical term for what we've been doing today is looking at the socio-cultural context. The socio-cultural context, okay? You've got to start with reality. And then the second step with that is trying to understand that reality a little better. So my hope is that today you've come to a richer understanding of secularity. When we use that word secular, that it's got to mean more than just no one's showing up to church anymore and people don't believe. But we've got a richer picture of what's actually going on. Okay? What's next in terms of content then would be to say, well, how might we respond to that? And I think a way to do that is actually, I've talked there about uncovering the process of evangelisation, because I think that the church has given us, since Vatican II, and in every major magisterial document, official church teaching on mission ever since, the church has talked about a process for evangelisation. And to pay attention to that, and then what we want to do ultimately is meld those two things, what we've done today with that process together. We meld that together and then we've got some ideas about how might we go forward in youth ministry and indeed other forms of evangelisation. So I'm hoping that that's leaving you hanging, to be honest, because I'd like you to come back next time. I'm hoping that you'll come back to explore something of that, something more of that. What we want to do now, though, just briefly, is just take a moment to just buzz next to somebody, talk to someone next to you. What struck you? Got any questions? Something you passionately disagreed with? I threw out a couple of little provocative kind of comments there. Feel free to come back around those, or something else that's grabbed your fancy.